Doug, good to see you, man. Thanks
Hey, man.
for making a little time to talk. Yeah, I was thinking about you the other day. I mean, time flies, man. I think we met back in 2013, so it's been over a decade
Yeah.
since the iCube days. Anyway, I appreciate your perspective. I know you do a lot of outsourced CFO and finance work. I consider you, you're the top of the field of what you do. We've been able to work
Mhm.
on some mutual clients together a lot over the years. I'm very grateful for that. So I wanted to, basically give some exposure to you and what you're doing and make sure our
Mhm.
client base knows about, your skill set and kind of what you're up to in the marketplace. For business owners who may not know you, what's your background and tell us a little bit about, kind of your journey and then like what you do now in terms of the outsourced CFO and finance work.
Sure. So I'm a recovering banker. I spent my first 15 years in banking. I grew up in Raleigh. I live in Raleigh today. I grew up in Raleigh, and I tell folks that I got out of high school. I went all the way to Chapel Hill to go to college, and I got out of college and I went all the way to Winston-Salem to go work for Wachovia Bank back in the
Yeah.
day. And I was there for a couple of years in Winston-Salem, and then the bank sent me to Raleigh. I was here for about 5 years, and then the bank sent me to Texas. I was in Texas for a couple of years, and then back in with the bank in Raleigh for another 4 or 5 years. So all told, about 15 years. Then I left and went to go work for a client at the time where we met, and that was
Yeah.
my first CFO role. And then I've been doing CFO work for the last 13 or 14 years, and kind of across the spectrum of, small startups, up to PE backed, larger PE backed groups as well. So things kind of runs the gamut.
Yeah, and I have you in my mind the pretty deep specialty with healthcare, so I want to hear about that. So talk
Mhm.
to me about industry concentration, and then also on the revenue cycle, where do you think someone like you makes a lot of sense, right? Like, what's too early? What's too late? Kind of where's the sweet spot, maybe either from an
Mhm.
employee headcount or revenue perspective, where you're a great fit?
So as far as industries, probably the majority of what I do is in healthcare. And I work with, again, probably on the healthcare side, probably 5 or 10 million on the small side, up to a couple 100 million on the top end from a revenue standpoint. And I also do work in technology and professional services. And those are technology and professional services. A lot of times they're kind of smaller. They're in that kind of 3 to 10 or 15 million range.
Yeah.
But I would say probably 80 or 90% of my business is in healthcare.
Random question back to your banking days. Do you still own a
Yeah,
suit?
I do, man. It's in fact I had to buy one a year or two ago. Because I'm not as svelte as I used to be. I own a suit, but it gathers a lot of dust.
Hear that. I think post COVID really nuked the suits for me. And I mean, I still wear them every now and then. I had a moment in the last 6 months where I was in a hotel room. I was traveling, and it's the first time I wore a suit in a long time. And my wife's not there to help me, but I get dressed. I got to be out the door in like 5 minutes, and I'm trying to like get that last button buttoned and try to fit into this thing. Man, had to like have somebody in the hotel lobby help me get that thing on.
Yeah, yeah, I know the feeling.
Okay, so you're getting a bird's eye view into all these different companies, come
Mhm.
from the finance CFO seat. What are some trends that you're seeing? Like, this is where I think people like you are really valuable. We collectively get a bird's eye view into companies, me from legal, you from finance. What are the trends that you're seeing? I mean, are there common mistakes that you see people making? If there's a COO or CEO listening, right, and they feel like they're, maybe not hitting on all marks on the finance front, like help fill in some of the gaps there based on your bird's eye view.
So one of the, I guess, the best way to describe, the way that I get involved sometimes is, a long time ago, somebody who wound up being a client reached out to me and they said, "Hey, I was at a kid's soccer game this weekend." He was a founder of a business. He said, "I was at a kid's soccer game this weekend, and I was talking to a buddy of mine who happened to be a banker that I worked with in a prior life." And he said, "I told him I don't know exactly what I need, but I can't keep doing what I've been doing." And that was, and that kind of encapsulates, especially on the smaller end, when somebody is going to typically need the services of somebody like me. So you had also asked about trends. So there's a couple of trends in terms of what we're seeing. AI, artificial intelligence is a big buzz term these days. And I'll say I've been a skeptic of it until the last few months. And what I'm seeing is that it is actually transforming a lot of businesses and a lot of industries. Right now, it's still at the point where it's kind of a competitive advantage as companies can figure out how to utilize it.
Yeah.
in their back office operations.
Right.
In another year, it's going to be a disadvantage for folks that haven't figured out how to use it to streamline, whether it's their accounting function, whether it's some of their operations and administrative functions and things like that.
Yep.
Because what it's doing is it's taking a lot of costs out of the infrastructure for companies.
Right.
And so, you can do a whole lot more with a whole lot less than
Yep.
you used to be able to. And so there it will be, I have a feeling it's going to be deflationary on rates and on fees and
Uh,
prices.
You're weaving your banking background right back in. I love that.
I don't know about interest rates,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's a big trend I see. IT security, everybody is getting nailed with whether it's malware, whether it's phishing, anything like that. There's everybody that bought cyber policies 10 years ago and was trying to figure out if it was really worth the money is now
Yeah.
figuring out whether or not it's worth the money. Like
Mhm.
it's rampant. So those are the two big trends from an operational standpoint.
Yeah, it's almost like looking in a mirror. That really resonates with me. The AI thing is obviously the adoption rate's crazy, scary high compared to like the internet back in the day.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, right? I mean, a lot of people are embracing it and innovating, which is great for the market, great for the consumer generally. There's a lot of savings kind of on the back end, efficiency, keep costs down. It's interesting with legal, right? Our time is our inventory, right? So the billable hour's been around for a long time, and maybe this is the final death nail. But I mean, at a minimum, we're getting way more efficient. I mean, we're certainly using it to save on the back end, but I think where we're also pushing, and I think heavily, maybe even leading the industry, is pushing it on the front end so that if the same legal task took X hours, now it's going to take Y hours, dramatically reduced, and that's going to impact top line, but it's also going to make, if you don't do it, you're just obsolete, right? That's where the market's moving. And if we can keep client services the North Star, that's kind of the trick. And then the other
Yeah.
thing you mentioned that really resonates with me is the kind of the pivot point. If you remember, I had my own firm for a little while, for about a decade, and before we joined Michael Best. I think you were involved in this in some ways, at least as a friend, referral source. I mean, we went from 1 to 50 people, and the need for financial insight, someone like you, almost like a fractional or outsourced CFO, um, was really I underestimated that, and I waited too long, right? I mean, like the business
Mhm.
changed so many times between 2 and 4 and 6 and 8 and 10 million that you wake up one day and you're like, I'm not a baby business anymore. Like this thing needs another level of sophistication. And so that's why I was curious about when you think the right time is, but it sounds like it
Yeah.
varies depending on industry, whether it's PE backed or not.
Yeah, I think it varies. I've seen in terms of what is the right time because founders will have different skill sets. So, and someone who has a strong financial or accounting background, especially in today's world, could get to a decent size without having to bring in somebody else. And then I've worked with some firms that are 3 million in revenue, and so it really depends on the complexity of the business,
Yeah.
and also how many outside capital partners do you have, like
Yeah.
from a debt standpoint, from an equity standpoint. If you've got PE involved, or if you think you're going to get PE involved, then you probably need to have a CFO at the table.
Yeah. I'm curious if you have a similar experience with Mace. I meet a client executive, C-suite executive. I'll see their LinkedIn profile. I'll sit down and have coffee with them and hear about their business, and they'll quote top line, bottom line, number of employees, growth, all these different things, and it all sounds great, right? That's kind of the polished version. But then you get under the hood, you start working with the person, you look at the financials, right? It's a little bit of a
Yeah.
different story. So I'd love to hear about. Do you have some examples of things that you're seeing where like maybe there's a disconnect between CEO, founder, the way they tell the story, and then what the financials actually say?
Yeah, the company will talk about sales, they'll talk about revenue, things like that. What I see a lot of times, particularly in healthcare, is revenue cycle, because some firms are still on a cash basis. Healthcare is one of those industries where you can actually get to a pretty good size and still stay on a cash basis, especially if you don't have any outside debt or anything like that. But if like in healthcare, one of the first things I ask people is, what does your AR look like and what does your revenue cycle look like? And no matter what their answer is, if they can't give me some specific numbers,
Mm.
then it doesn't really matter what the answer is because they don't really know.
Right.
Like and especially like again in healthcare, revenue cycle is the biggest beast. Like finance and accounting from a healthcare standpoint is actually not that difficult.
Mhm.
Revenue cycle is the biggest piece. How are you coding, billing claims, submitting claims, and collecting them? So those are the biggest things is, do they know the numbers? Do they know the data? And some
Mhm.
of the, in terms of like, what do you see when you get in? A lot of times, and I don't know if you see this, you'll hear a business owner will tell you about the symptoms of the issue. And then when you start digging in, like you're probably looking at the agreements. I'm looking a little bit at the agreements and a little bit at the financials, and you can kind of piece together what that story looks like. And because people usually don't call me because things are going well. Like 9 times out of 10, when somebody calls me, it's because something's bad's happened. Like either they had a bad conversation with their banker, their CFO quit, they've uncovered fraud, or their AR is upside down. And what what I see a lot of times, and in fact, like just in the last couple of weeks, I've seen it, is that organizations will get pretty far down the road, like whether it's debt, whether it's with a big project, and they haven't actually done the blocking and tackling on the front end. They haven't done their homework on the front end, and say, okay, well, what is this going to do to our business, both on the revenue and the profitability side, but also on our debt service side, on our capex side? What does this mean for us? That's one of the big things that I see is there are banks out there that will lend you more money than you could pay back.
Mm.
And then when you get sideways, they're like, well, why didn't you know that this was going to be a problem? That is not an uncommon issue.
You brought up the banking thing again. I've always been surprised. I rewind back to the Forrest firm days when I was, a customer and now working with clients and kind of getting a glimpse into the banking relationships. I always thought that banks were like all the same, right? Like you could go shop banks and you get like the same rate generally, the
Mm-hmm.
same appetite for risk, the same, you're either a good borrower or a bad borrower. They're all within a certain range, right? But I don't know. Looking at it a little bit more closely, I mean, banks are kinda all over the place, depending on
Yeah.
what industry they're focused on, what their risk tolerance is, what they're trying to accomplish this quarter. You can be a good borrower one day and a bad borrower the next, or a bad customer the next. So it's really
Yeah.
kind of interesting to me how much beta there is in the banking world.
Yeah. There's a lot. There are folks that you might go to if you want the lowest rate, and a lot of borrowers, a lot of clients, like on the front end, they want the most money for the lowest rate.
Yep.
Period. And that's all fine until you have a hiccup, and then you want somebody who actually knows the business and will be patient with you, and it can help you ride things out. But you see that on banking, like especially kind of on the operated side, you see it a little bit. Where you've really seen it in the last year or so is on the private equity side, like in private equity deals. Um, you've there's been a lot more deals and relationships that PE groups and firms thought they had with lenders that all of a sudden aren't quite as solid as they thought they
Mhm.
were. And in those deals, there's much less room for error, and so
Right.
it's becomes an interesting conversation.
Tell me about how you help companies plan for growth, right? Revenue high, expenses low, create EBITDA. But what that doesn't factor in, like if you're running a law firm like what we do, that makes some sense, right? Because partners generally distribute out the income at the end of the year. But if you're looking to grow through acquisition or organic or otherwise, like what does it look like to plan not just for this year's EBITDA, but kind of for the future?
There's so a board chairman in a company several years ago said something that has always resonated with me. And he said, "If we build a good business, we'll have plenty of options." See a lot of companies now that are started and grown with the exit in mind, and in a situation like that, if you're not careful, then you're not actually building a business. You're just building a product that you're hoping somebody's going to buy one day. In my mind, you just want to build a healthy business. You want to make sure that if you are taking on debt, or if you are taking on equity, that you're doing it for the right reasons. With debt, that you're matching up your assets and liabilities because you want to have flexibility. If you keep your leverage manageable and you have a good product or service, then you have a lot of flexibility. Like I remember in 2009, but as everything was falling apart, there was this old guy who owned a pretty big plumbing contractor firm, and I met him one night and we were talking about kind of everything going on in business, and I asked him how things were going, and he said, well, I can hold my breath a whole lot longer than a lot of these other guys can, so we're doing just fine. And what he was saying is that, like he had managed his business, like he'd not over leveraged, he'd not gone out and bought a whole bunch of equipment and stuff like that. And so he was being opportunistic about kind of calling shots.
Yeah.
And that's because you don't know when things are going to turn. 3 months ago, I don't think anybody would have said, "Hey, I think we're going to invade Iran and it's going to make oil prices spike up." Now, well, not talking politically or anything, but If that cools off in 3 weeks, oil prices come back down, then it may be nothing. But if oil prices stay up for a
Yeah.
while, you're going to see a lot of people do a lot of desperate things. And so just kind of keeping dry powder as much as you can is probably the most important.
Talk about 2008, it is crazy, man. I mean, that's almost 20 years in the rearview mirror. I started practicing law in 2004, and for the longest time, there was more people in the workforce that had lived through that than not. And now I look around, it's like, man, some of these people, I mean, they weren't practicing law then. So I'm not trying to jinx
Yeah.
us. I hope we have, 20 more years of prosperity in the greatest country in the world, but it's crazy how fast that's gone by. Tell me about any war stories on the over focusing on revenue as opposed to expenses. And legal kind of is in the same bucket, right? I mean, sometimes, many times, your CEO is a sales driven person, new revenue, and then people like you come in on the back end, right, and help on the finance piece, which creates profit. So both are needed and both are very valuable. Legal's more on the finance side. Talk to me about that. Do you see that as a trend where you get C-suite executives who are maybe a little bit over focused on revenue and not as much on profitability?
It happens. I see it occasionally, and it happens in large and small groups. If you're talking to a private equity backed group, they will, if they want to grow, you know, private equity doesn't invest in companies for them to not grow. So like these groups take on private equity money and they start, looking around and trying to grow, and they will overpay for things. And I've seen it a decent bit where you overpay for things. And, you know, sometimes you overpay for something, it's not, but if you overpay for it, you overpay for an asset or for a company and you finance it with 100% debt, and all of a sudden that business, just starts to wither away, whatever that acquired business is. It puts a lot of unnecessary pressure on the organization. And so when people focus on revenue too much, like it makes them lose sight of, does it make sense?
Right.
Um, I'll, I've also seen it when companies that talk in terms of ARR, recurring revenue. If you're depending on what those contracts look like, and not even in the ARR and SaaS space, but if you're working with contracts, and especially if they're front end loaded contracts, you could have a decent bit of revenue that if you get contracts that are paid on the front end or paid heavily on the front end, that can mask a whole lot of weakness in the company. And I've seen more than one company that will, they get all this money on front end and they still have all these obligations to deliver on in the back end, and then they have a hiccup, and
Sure.
that becomes a challenge.
Tell me about professional advisor communication. So what I mean by that is from my seat, many times the lawyers are expensive, so they get held at arm's length. Accounting also expensive on an outside hourly basis, held at arm's length at some level. And there's so much of the risk management portfolio that has to be managed by those professionals. So it's the finance people, internal, outside accounting, outside legal. In my opinion, because they never seem to all talk to each other. We never kind of get in the room together, or not as much as I would like, because that's an expensive meeting, number one. But two, a lot of things tend to fall through the cracks, right? Because they're not communicating. I'd love to hear your perspective on that and where you see value really driven for a company.
If your outside advisors are aware of each other and are also aware of what initiatives or things that the others are working on, then they can say, if I'm sitting down with a client and they say something that triggers a thought, I might say, well, hey, have you asked James about this? Or like, does James know that you're thinking about this? Or, on the accounting side, have you told Bob, like, you're talking about changing up your distribution schedule or bringing in another partner? You talk to your CA about this. And knowing, kind of having a relationship between those partners, or at least having those folks in contact and in communication, it just makes things more efficient. It's the old adage, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I wish I should have called you earlier. I just didn't want to pay the fee. You could have paid my fee for a couple of hours and I could have saved you a few $1,000s. It's Fortunately, people usually only make that mistake once. Having a good network of folks that are kind of working together, or at least aware of each other, is helpful.
As I get older with a little bit more experience, I've been at this 22 years. I have a what I call the been there, done that test. And I can usually tell within the first 30 minutes when a client walks in or I first start working with them, they've been there, done that, right? And been there, done that is, it's not a knock on people that haven't been there, done that. But if you haven't been
Yeah.
there, done that, meaning walked through something really hard on the legal front, 6, 8 figure liability, then you're like, why do I need to call the lawyer? Like, driving the car without the oil change you might get away with it 6 months, a year, 2 years. 3 years. Who knows how long you get rid of it? But
Yeah.
at some point, you gotta deal with it. So I'm glad I'm not the only one.
It also impacts whether or not you take somebody on as a client.
Right.
If and in fact, one of the things that I started writing down, if I'm talking to somebody, if somebody says, "Hey, would you speak to this person? We'll see if this might be somebody you can help with." Like in that first conversation, in the first few minutes of talking to them, like you can identify that whether or not this person is actually going to, do they see the value that you're going to bring to the table, or do
Right.
they just see you as kind of a necessary evil, or just somebody to check the box? I don't know how you handle folks like that, but sometimes it's just not worth.
Right.
Going back to the revenue, all revenue is not the same.
I'll chalk that up to my own been there, done that story. I think very early in my career, it's like you just have a big open wide door and you'll take everybody because you're so desperate for revenue and upward trajectory and all those things. But I think having been there, done that for a couple decades now, you start to realize that the Harvard Business Review people that tell you to fire your bottom 20% all the time are probably right.
Yeah, there's good customer service and good client service. There's also being a good client,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's just not a good fit.
All right, rounding third here, headed for home. Talk to me about A. I know at any given time you've got a handful, maybe a little bit more clients that you're working with. Whatever window of time you want to take, 6 months, 6 years, something. It doesn't matter. But like, what are you seeing maybe in terms of A market trends?
So market trends are tricky because the market is so strange right now. There's for the last couple of years, like in healthcare, for the last 2 or 3 years, deals have been there have been hung deals in the PE universe. Folks that they had a company in their portfolio for 3 or 4 years, and you know, all of a sudden they realize that the market's not there, so they have to hold on to them for another 2 or 3 years. But as far as trends, people are being a lot more choosy now. We're kind of at the point in the cycle where there's a lot more show me or prove it to me. There's not as much reckless acquisitions going on. So that's probably one thing that I've seen a lot. And now with my clients that are not, they may not be in the market right now, but if they're thinking about kind of going to market or trying to start a process in the next year or so, it's okay. Well, this is the time for us to tighten up our internal processes. This is the time for us to start gathering all our contracts, because in due diligence, that's one of the biggest headaches, is trying to track down every vendor contract that you've got. So yeah, those are. I would say this is a time where a lot of business owners, if they don't have to sell, are thinking long and hard about whether or not they want to, or if they just want to hold on to it for a while. And then there's a lot of deals that are that are hitting the pause button. Uh,
Yeah, I agree with that. I see that as well. I think for a little while there, it was like business owners were hanging on for the market to, in air quotes, come back to the valuations that we had at the peak. And then I think we're now solidly in a place where most people realize that maybe that probably won't happen anytime soon, right? Or however you want to look at it, with interest rates or M&A valuations. But there was a lot of froth out there for a little while, and people kind of got used to it. Like this is normal, and it was not normal. So that's kind of proven out. I think the market is a lot tighter. Know if we've seen something as powerful as AI in my lifetime. And so because of that, I think you see a lot of overemphasis on it in the market. It's driving valuations in that sector specifically. But then for the average business where a deal would have gotten done 3 years ago, I think people are more patient because they're like, hey, I want to see this shake out for another 12, 24 months before I put money. I don't want to be the guy holding the bag. If this business is worth this today and this much less the next day because of AI, I don't want to be the one that takes that ride down.
yeah, yeah. A lot of technology companies are seeing that. It's kind of a microcosm of what's happening in the public market. You see, companies like Adobe and Intuit, and companies that are solid companies, but they've just been getting crushed because people have, there's so much uncertainty around what's going to happen to them long term when AI takes hold. But and in the smaller private company space, I've heard a lot of bankers have said, "Well, what are you doing about AI?" Like I've been on calls with a couple of bankers, a couple of investment bankers with clients, and they're like, "Well, how you're handling AI? Like, what are you doing to address AI?" And if you don't have a good story to tell, like for better or for worse, it's a mark against you.
Last question, my friend. So you gave kind of the revenue range of folks you're working with on the small end all the way up to the larger end. Let's say the business owner listening who's at 75 million top line, they're looking to get to 150. Industry agnostic. What's like the most important thing that you think you could offer them from an insight perspective, from your seat, what you've seen, this outsourced CFO role? What's your piece of advice to them?
I think kind of going back to something I said earlier, you know, try to make sure that you've got a decently healthy business. watch your liabilities, watch your debt, watch your invest in. One thing that I think a lot of business owners, one of the traps that they get into is that the business owner, the founder, is often your best salesperson.
Yeah.
And after they have kind of proven viability of whatever the business is,
Right.
they spend the next however long trying to get out of that role,
Yeah.
and they might get out of it a couple of times and wind up, but they're always going to get dragged back into that chief development officer role or sales role or whatever it is. And I think I would almost tell people, don't spend so much time fighting trying to get out of that, because there's a decent chance you're going to get dragged back into it.
Yeah. That's good stuff, man. How can people get in touch with you if you'd like for them to get in touch with you? LinkedIn, or you have a website or an email?
LinkedIn, or my website is Viewpoint CFO.
Awesome. Great. Go in the first half. So we'll see how that shakes out.
All right.
Great to see
All
you,
right.
man. Thank you for doing this. I really
Thanks, Shane.
appreciate the friendship and the opportunity to work on lots of clients together.
Likewise.